Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan Jeyarajah and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, bienvenidos, minasan. It's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my fantabulous co-host Shehan Jeyarajah, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We're glad to have you with us. The spring portal window opened this week and names are flying. Teams are shopping, NIL collectives are plotting, and traditionalists are shaking their fists in disapproval. Shehan and I are going to run through the state of the transfer portal as we continue through the spring. And also, maybe at the end, we'll talk about a few of the spring games. Probably not a whole lot. I know Shehan thinks a lot of the big ones have already happened, but there are a couple back there. But before we dive in, let me remind you that you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Please take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. I'm looking forward to this. It's going to be more fun than a tug of war with a live anaconda. But before I do, right before we kind of got to getting ready to do this show, because this is a Wednesday, I have to just make one reference to Scott Drew, the Baylor basketball coach, who apparently has now signed the booth that he was in, where he kind of put down those rumors he was going to Kentucky. I love that. That booth, that if that restaurant doesn't survive, they have to get the booth out, remove it, and place it in the Baylor Hall of Fame. It's got to be like preserved for all time, because the legend of that booth is growing. And if I'm that restaurant, I'm going to start maybe keeping it for premium guests or something like that, because that booth is absolutely getting its own story now.
Yeah, it's something. Again, this is like some random restaurant in like the suburbs of Waco. It is not it's not like a Baylor place even. Like, I've never been there. You got to go a little out of town actually to get there. I'll actually be in Waco early next week. And so I'm like, all right, well, I guess I have to go. Now I'll get to see a signed wall, I guess. It'll be fascinating to see, like, if it's still, I mean, I've seen updates from the restaurant. The restaurant is packed, people wanting to sit in the booth and all this sort of stuff. It's a weird world. We have a weird job talking about this stuff, but man, do I love it.
Oh, I have an update. Mi Casita's booth is now entering the transfer portal. He is going to be interviewed by, is it a he? I don't know what a booth is, but anyway, sorry. Go with that. But all right. So, the portal, obviously, it's only been active for a little more than a day as we record this. And just as a quick reminder, it's a 15-day window. So, as we just said, there's some spring games that are going to be coming up later. There's going to be some conversations with coaches and players and where they're going to see themselves in the pecking order. We absolutely could see more players enter at later times, and players that might be more notable than others. Typically, the spring portal window always seems to be a little bit more of backfilling for programs. They kind of see where they need to get some depth and maybe go in that direction. A couple of programs are looking for some higher profile players. By all accounts, there's a significant uptick in the number of student athletes, players looking at the portal window right now. There are a couple of reasons why. You could argue that the portal at each year it's going, and it's still a fairly recent thing, is maturing, and more players are realizing they can use it as a way to potentially advance their career. As well as the fact that for those who were paying attention in the legal world, Tennessee and the state of Virginia challenged the NCAA's transfer policies, and they won. And the NCAA is basically acceded to this, and they're changing the rules to allow for basically unlimited transfer. The NCAA is going to try and link that a bit to academic status, which they may be able to argue that one. But for right now, players no longer have to wait and graduate before transferring again. On Tuesday alone, there were 47 scholarship players from FBS going into the portal as repeat transfers. I believe the leader in the clubhouse, at least of this morning, was Georgia State, which has a new coach, G5 program with 13 players. But at the rate Colorado's going, who knows who's gonna be in the lead once this is all over. But all of that said, I can't wait to see what the NCAA video game does with this, because I'm hoping they're going to force an update every spring where your players all get jumbled up with the transfer portal. That would be amazing. If they do that, I will call this NCAA football game like brilliant beyond compare, because I've gotten semi-skeptical. But if they go hardcore and like force your roster updates, I'm all for it. All of that said, what's got your attention right now with the transfer portal? What themes are coming out to you?
Well, I think the first theme is a similar theme that we had heading into yesterday on to Tuesday, which is there are way more buyers than there are sellers. And what I mean by that is we put out an article over at cbssports.com talking about for every top 10 team what their top needs are. And a shocking amount of them, the answer is defensive line help, and especially defensive tackle help. But there are not very many defensive linemen and defensive tackles who are entering the portal because the players who fill those roles, they get, first of all, well compensated to stay where they are, but also are highly valued by their existing programs. Again, we had the conversation about Bear Alexander at USC last week. He would have been, of course, far and away the most valuable player to enter the portal if he had done it. He ended up staying put. And we've seen some movement on that front today, with TCU defensive tackle Dominic Williams entering the portal, somebody who was very likely to me to be a preseason first team all Big 12 selection. He was honorable mention last year, played a huge role on TCU's a team that made the national championship game in 2022. And it's funny. I think that for a player like him, who's a good player, like a really good player, a starting caliber player, basically anywhere in college football, I think that when you talk about opportunity cost, in some ways, it just got too great, right? If you are a top defensive tackle, if you enter the portal, Georgia might be banging down your door. Texas, Oregon, USC, all these programs might be trying to get to you. Oklahoma maybe being another. And a point that I made that I realized was his top two recruiters when he was at TCU have since moved on from TCU. One is the defensive line coach at Georgia now, and the other is an assistant at Oregon, another program that could be looking for defensive tackle help. So, look, that's my biggest takeaway from the first day is there are a lot of hungry teams hoping to make some fixes in the portal, but the supply of players who can play and contribute at a high level, I just don't think there's been all that many.
I think that's a great point because, as you pointed out, the always the in demand positions at this point: offensive line, defensive tackle, running backs. Sometimes you'll get even some there are people looking to back up their secondary a little bit, and it makes me think of as some of these players that are already in the portal, at those positions are getting taken. Are there going to be? I mean, what is going to be happening in the background? Because we've talked about that. The stuff we see, it's so funny. Even though a lot of this stuff is now above board, it's not, because a lot of this stuff arguably happened before the transfer portal. It just happened really quietly behind closed doors, unless you're SMU. And for those now, are we going to see? Are there still these back channels happening where, hey, we're still looking for defensive tackle? We know who's potentially looking for some of these guys out there. I mean, one of the other big names out there was actually from the MAC. CJ West, the defensive tackle, is also out there. And apparently a lot of interest around him because as much as the Golden Flashes, are, wanting to keep him there, they can't get into a bidding war with some of these larger programs. Once those guys settle in, is there going to be some, subterfuge, but whatever you want to call it, some back channel saying like, hey, if you enter the portal, we're still looking. That team is still looking, particularly after some people also additionally get some spring tape heading into this week, and there's going to be some more potential candidates out there. One team I do want to talk about just a little bit, only because an interesting Instagram post came out yesterday that got everyone's attention. So Shiloh Sanders, one of Dion's sons on the defensive side of the ball, put a post on his Instagram, all caps for the most part, which made me think he was an older real estate agent, only because I joke that real estate listings, and when it's an older person, it's all caps. I never like, why are you shouting? I know it's a nice house. But he wrote, defense transfers, DM me. Offense transfers, DM, and he put the hashtag for his, the Instagram tag for his brother Shador, and then in small letters, this is not last chance you. Now, there's two parts of this. First, let's talk about like this approach. Second, let's talk about the Colorado approach in general. Do you think this was this was the player acting on his own, because players recruit players. That's normal. That's totally fine. I mean, you always hear about the quarterbacks coming in and pulling in players. Was this? Do you think this was him trying to be proactive, or do you think he was kind of nudged to do something like this?
I think this was him being proactive because I think that from his perspective, and probably from Shador Sanders' perspective, I don't think they expected so many players to leave. There were 11 players who entered the transfer portal on the first day, which is a pretty unbelievable amount for a program that obviously lives in the transfer portal world. And there's a difference between losing players because you're processing them out versus losing players because they decide to move on. And I think that ultimately they're in a position where they're losing guys that they intended to keep. And so long term, I think that Shador and Shiloh, they understand in so many ways. And I'd add Travis Hunter to the mix. I'd even add Deion Sanders to the list. This is a program that needs to perform in 2024 because Shiloh's out of eligibility. Shador is expected to go to the NFL. Travis Hunter is expected to go to the NFL. And if they don't have a good year this year, let's say that they go from 4-8 to 3-9 or go 4-8 again. I think that any juice that they have as a program potentially goes away because they're starting from scratch. You're having to find a new quarterback. You're having to find a new secondary. You lost Cormani McLean, a 5-star to the portal. So that's, I think, the biggest thing is I think that these two players, Shiloh and Shador, understand, man, we have to try to figure this out. But the concern for me as somebody who's been around the sport for a while, who's been around recruiting for a while, is that the way that this process often works for very professionalized recruiting departments. Let's take Florida State last year. I got a chance to talk to some of their player personnel people. They have an eye on guys who might enter the portal, and they've completely done full evaluations of them. They know, like, within minutes, it's time, we're going after this player because they've decided to enter. What doesn't happen is saying, hey, players, can you check if we missed someone? Can you check if there's somebody there? Like, I want to be clear, there's a big difference between, for example, a player recruiting a guy to come to their school. For example, right, like, let's say Shador Sanders from DFW and a player from DFW enters the portal. Maybe you know him through back channels. Maybe you have a previous relationship with him from going in the same circles. That's one thing. What's different is, hey, can you crowdsource? Can you try to figure out if anybody might be interested? If somebody will DM you to figure out, hey, like, this is a good player who maybe has interest in going there. These are conversations that should already be happening. You should have an eye on guys when the portal opens. And so, look, I think that it got a little blown out of proportion, the idea of them being desperate or crowdsourcing or, whatever you want to call it. Because I do think that they're just trying to do their best, but it just falls in the same lane of concern as Deion Sanders saying, we don't do home visits. We don't build relationships with coaches. We don't build relationships with high school recruits. We only are going to take 9 or 10 high school players in a class. And I'll even point to specifically the relationships aspect with high school coaches. You know how a lot of people know that players might enter the portal is by having conversations with people from back home. It's not just, Quinn Ewers is going to enter the portal and we know that because he entered the portal. It's because, the coach at Texas has a relationship with this high school head coach, Riley Dodge. He has a relationship with people in South Dallas and North Dallas. So there's rumor, maybe even out in Columbus, by the way, as well. So there's rumor circulating so you can be prepared when that moment comes. And I think when you haven't built those grassroots relationships, that's when you kind of have to go to this level of saying, let's see what's out there.
It's something else. The only part of it I found a little weird was that last line. That's where I think it came from him. Like, this is not last chance you. I'm like, I don't think I thought of Colorado that way, but now that you've kind of mentioned it, you've sort of Streisand affected it a little bit where I'm like, is that how we're, and for those who somehow may not know, that was, of course, a popular series on Netflix about junior college football at a couple of different programs of note. And how some of the players before really the portal, that would be their place to go and kind of turn things around. Boy, when you think about that, what a radical change it's been, because now you can go to a team and perhaps even get a bit of a payday in the process. Maybe not a huge one, but you have a chance to maybe climb yourself back up. It'll be really interesting to see again as the years go on, how this affects JUCO football, which I don't want to get into the big side thing of there, but had kind of even before the pandemic, let me be clear, had seen a bit of had been a contraction when all of the Arizona JUCOs dropped football in short order due to they just couldn't support it, and we lost like 8 or 9 teams in one big go. Um, so you've touched on this a little bit with talking about Colorado, but obviously Deion Sanders seems to be under a lot of pressure to make it work, and he's heavily reliant on the portal. Are there other coaches who might be also kind of this is going to be a really important portal window for them, where they really need to potentially strengthen their hand before they enter the fall?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that certainly Colorado is atop the list, I think, of teams that are trying to rebuild the best that they can. And I will say too, just during this, I would make a distinction between teams like Colorado that are trying to build a team on the fly versus let's take Ole Miss for example, right? Who's trying to supplement some major places, but when you talk about programs that I think are really, really, really trying to hit, Cal is one. They've been really active so far in the portal. They've got 13 coming in, so I mean that's pretty significant, I think, just in terms of for a program like that to be as aggressive as they've been. And by the way, it's also tough for them because they have some of their academic requirements as well. But they're a program that comes to mind. I'll be curious what Auburn does in this portal window because I don't think that they need to rush the process necessarily, but I do think that they understand we need help at wide receiver. Quarterback is a position that we're going to be looking at. Offensive line, we could use some help at. And so, I mean, I think that they're a program who potentially starts getting into things and starts being ready. Another program that I've heard is trying to be aggressive, and I don't know if it's a good idea, and I don't even know if they're going to follow through with it, is Oklahoma. Oklahoma, of course, has had 2 back-to-back really good recruiting classes, but they want some more win now help. They potentially are in a position where they've lost all 5 starting offensive linemen, and they added a few more back through the portal, but I think they could try to add another potentially. And defensively, they added a fantastic defensive tackle prospect in David Stone as a top 10 recruit, but I don't know if they think he's ready to be a linchpin of that defense right away. There were moments where Oklahoma's defense looked improved last year. There were moments where it looked pretty dang bad. So I do think that they're going to be pretty aggressive trying to build it up. And the other piece with Oklahoma, too, is that they are going to be compared in so many ways to Texas coming into the SEC and also to some of their old historic rivals like Missouri, who are in that league as well. So this is a critical season, I think, for Oklahoma, and I wouldn't be surprised to see them try to get after it just a little bit.
I was somewhat humored that this weekend we have spring games for Oklahoma, Texas, and Texas A&M. I'm like, oh man, those three. Can you ask? Too bad I don't know if they're at the exact same time, but that would be even more perfect. So they get to really kind of get into their wonderful comparisons there. Um, you know, it's kind of interesting to think about the spring portal window compared to the winter one, the December portal window, because we've seen a couple players arrive and just from what we've seen, they've been absolutely as advertised. Cam Ward at Miami, by all accounts, is exactly what they every team kind of hoping to get Cam Ward kind of hoped what they would get what they saw at that spring game. Talon Green at Arkansas seeming good so far. Dorian Singer at Utah. There's been players. I'm just naming a few. But some probably may not have worked out quite as hoped, and those are going to be the awkward ones where you see a team maybe dip back into the portal for that same position. But some of the notable names that have been in there. I mean, the most obvious, the one that I think earliest got everyone's attention was Caden Proctor, only because it was the first of this weird series that you get a guy who leaves a team in December and then, or actually say January, because of course that was the Saban departure, and then is coming right back to the same team. One of the funnier comments I saw, at least on RCFB on Reddit, was homeboy went to Iowa just to see Caitlin Clark play. I respect it. I love that. Somebody pointed out like he got student tickets. He got to see Caitlin Clark play. Now he's heading back to Alabama to play some serious football. But that had been a weird one for the folks at Iowa. But as you mentioned, Cormani McClain, I know you wrote about him for CBS Sports. Demonic Williams was just a little bit earlier today. There's obviously several others. David Martinez from Oregon State talked a lot about him. Sounds like a lot of people are interested in him. You kind of feel, again, we've talked about how bad we feel for the folks at Oregon State and all of this, but he's looking to become one of the top running backs in the 2025 NFL draft. So he's got apparently visits everywhere. I've heard Miami, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi State, Arizona. Who knows? I mean, I'm sure Ole Miss will be.
Sounds a little like he's seeking a bag with a list of teams like that.
Yeah.
There's not a whole lot of rhyme or reason to what's going on other than that. I will also say, to go back to your quarterback point, one of the more interesting dynamics that I feel like we've seen during the quarterback window is quarterback battles are getting decided by who's entering the portal. And of course, whether it's a formal, we're naming this guy the starter, or just reading tea leaves, I think that regardless, it's been that kind of year. So I look at a player like Nick Evers, who was competing with Tyler Van Dyke at Wisconsin for the starting job, originally transferred from Oklahoma. That tells us that Tyler Van Dyke is going to be the starting quarterback. Timmy McClain from UCF, same deal. It's going to be KJ Jefferson. Not a huge surprise there. Ja'Carri Brown, we talked about Cam Ward. He was everything that I think that people hoped. Colin Schlee was a couple days ago from UCLA, but same deal. Ethan Garbers appears to be the guy. Taylon Green pushing out Jacoby Criswell. There's a lot of examples of guys. Max Johnson actually would be another at North Carolina, pushing out Tad Hudson. So there's a lot of examples of quarterback battles being de facto decided. And the other piece of this too that's going to be fascinating is there have been some, let's call them like good backups who have entered the portal, guys who maybe can be depth. I look at a player like Micah Bowens, who was at Oklahoma and Penn State for a while, transferring from Charlotte. Does he end up at a major program to be a sort of full-time backup? Is that the thought process there? I know that Cooper Legis from Utah State played pretty well last year. He just re-entered the portal. Same deal. Does he end up going somewhere where he can be more of a backup? So I think that if you are looking to find a starting quarterback in the post-spring window, then you're probably in big trouble. I don't think that that's a good way to do things. One, because of the quality of player who's in the portal in terms of just experience. And two, because they'll only have the fall to get ready. But I do think that there are a lot of guys in the portal that if they choose to be backups, if that's a role that they embrace, potentially you see some nice upside there.
One of the things that's fascinating in all of the conversation about the portal, a lot of times we get distracted by the top players going to the top teams or who the real championship contenders are taking. And I just also want to mention that there's a lot of people moving in every direction. And there's examples of that. Obviously, Mizzou famously last year got the star running back from D2, but also the G5 programs that maybe are getting picked for some of their top players are also finding guys who were backups at the P5 who go there and end up doing well. I mean, Penny Boone has been an interesting one because he's at Louisville. He was at Louisville. He was originally at Maryland. Couldn't quite break into the starting lineup. Goes to Toledo. Is the MAC Offensive Player of the Year last season. So last December, he goes to Louisville. Decides this apparently that he's not getting quite the feature. I mean, we're assuming here, but he must not be getting the feature status he desired, which I thought was strange because last season we kind of associated Louisville with having kind of a multi-headed running back situation with some real talent. So I'm not sure what he thought he was getting into, but whatever it is, he wants to be, I think, more of a featured back. So he's going back in the portal. But I love his story because it's multidimensional. You have a guy who was at a Big Ten program, decided it wasn't quite working where he wanted it to go. So he goes to a good G5 program. Everyone now sees him. He gets into a title contender team. And then now, after a spring kind of test run, he's decided it's not working out. I know some people are frowning on how quickly some of the players are moving, but it used to be kind of, I felt sympathy for players. I'm going to give an example. And this is not personal story. It wasn't like my bestie or anything like that. But the guy on my high school program who was like the quarterback who people thought was going to do well, he goes to the local team I'm not going to say because I don't want to specify too much, but he goes to the local team in my area, an FBS program. By all accounts, he was a favorite to start. And then he gets in the coach's doghouse. The backup goes in. The backup, well, let's just say he went number one in the NFL draft. So he never got to start again. He Wentworth became a tight end, where historically, if you're a quarterback stuck on the roster, that's kind of where you went in your final years. A guy like that, I was just thinking today, like in the portal era, if this wasn't working out for him, he could have gone to another team. Maybe that would have been his success. But in the old days, man, you were stuck in some of these situations. So if I have to look at that old way and I have to look at the current way, where if a player gets there and realizes, man, this is not what I signed up for, or these coaches, I kind of fell, because they're young guys. That's the thing. Some of these folks, they're under 20. I don't know how savvy some of you all were at that age, but it's easy to trick some people here, especially when they haven't been world savvy, or perhaps the people advising them aren't qualified to advise them at all. So it's nice that they get an opportunity to realize they may have fallen for some marketing bells and whistles, smoke and mirrors, and get a chance to maybe reset. I'm not saying that's exactly what happened with Penny Boone. I'm sure I'm going to assume most programs, when they bring somebody in, you're hoping to fill your roster with somebody who's going to be incredible. But sometimes they aren't. Sometimes they're the ones that actually galvanize the guys on your roster to step up. But yeah, I think some of these stories, and I love that Penny Boone story, because it shows the multi-layer this to a lot of these transfer things that I sometimes get missed. But for those of you who are G5 fans, please don't get sad if one of your players leaves. Okay, I can understand. It's okay, for the moment. But the future, you'd be surprised who your coaches can find. They're qualified at their jobs. They can find those guys. That's the reason why they got to be head coaches for the most part, with some notable exceptions, which we shall not name. But have hope. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the spring portal. I mean, again, who knows what's going to happen after next weekend? Can't wait to talk about that more. We'll be right back here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
So as we kind of get ready to slowly close this out, there are, as we mentioned, a couple of spring games coming up, more than a couple, but a number of spring games coming up this weekend. Once again, you could divide them into sections. I mean, I was thinking the contenders, the ones that really, I think, plausibly could be in that college football playoff race. We have Notre Dame. And from the SEC, we got Texas and Oklahoma, those proud SEC programs. We've got proud Big Ten programs like USC, as well as Michigan and Iowa. I'm going to still throw Iowa in there. I think you never know. Iowa's such an unpredictable program. ACC on Friday, we've actually got Louisville, and then we got Florida State and North Carolina. I'll throw them in as well. Big 12, not many. I mean, there are two, I think, Big 12 programs. Dave Aranda, we'll see where it goes. Baylor's one of them, and Iowa State's the other. I was actually surprised how few Big 12 programs are out there. Maybe because they previously had planned that it was going to be Texas and Oklahoma, and maybe, I don't know. But of the contenders, and let's throw Texas A&M out there, because if TCU could make the national championship the first season with a new coach, Mike Elko seems to be a qualified enough guy that he might be able to pull that kind of dark horse. It's weird to call Texas A&M dark horse with all the money involved, but they could pull that off. But of the spring games out there, which have your attention?
Yeah, well, I mean, Texas Tech is another Big 12 team too that has their spring game this upcoming week. But I think that for me, I am fascinated to see what Texas A&M looks like. Texas A&M, of course, bringing in Colin Klein as their offensive coordinator from Kansas State, and I think that defensively, they've had to turn over a lot of their defense, but they've brought in players that they like a lot. And actually, one thing that stood out to me from spring camp was Torian York, their sophomore linebacker, was named a team captain. And he's a true sophomore. He was a 3-star recruit. And by the way, when he committed to Texas A&M, he was actually getting heavily recruited by Mike Elko at Duke. So this has been a perfect match so far. And obviously he's earned the respect of his teammates. So I'm fascinated to see. I kind of see them as potentially a fun, encouraging 8-win team this season. But the upside's there. Like, they lost a lot of players from their great recruiting class, but this is one of the most talented rosters in college football still. And I don't think they've gotten enough attention for how effectively during the cycle they've used the transfer portal. It's not just the number of guys that they've gotten, but they've been very targeted with some of the players that they've got. Nick Scorenton, the Purdue defensive end, being a chief example of this. I'm also, of course, going to be watching very closely at Oklahoma and Texas. I mean, these are two programs that expect to have success right away in the SEC. And I think Texas is probably a little more built to do it in the short term than Oklahoma is. And, with Oklahoma, we're going to be looking at things as basic as who's starting on the offensive line? What players are playing together? Do they look ready? Does Jackson Arnold look like he's ready to deal with the kind of pressure that he's going to be facing? Does Oklahoma's defensive line, are they growing up? Are they ready? Or do they need to go hit the portal some more? I think that some of these questions might actually be asked and answered by this staff during the spring game because, it's going to be a huge opportunity for them to get some live reps in front of real fans. And on the Texas side, it's going to be receiver for me. Receiver is going to be the biggest thing that I'm looking at after losing A.D. Mitchell and Xavier Worthy to the draft. I trust relatively that, offensive line, they bring a decent amount back. Running back has been a strong position for them, and defensively, they've been reasonably strong. But wide receiver is going to be the position that I probably keep an eye on most as we head into this spring game.
So beyond Isaiah Bond,
Yeah,
assuming
beyond
that way,
Isaiah-
he's probably going to be good.
Oh yeah, well, and they've got some incredible returners, guys who are maybe young players ready to step up. Jonte Cook was a 5-star recruit. Ryan Wingo in this past recruiting class was but I think he was number 6 when he signed. He fell down a little bit late in the process, but legitimate 5-star, of course. They brought in Matthew Golden as a transfer from Houston, which it's not very nice, if I'm being quite honest, to just go and take Matthew Golden from Houston because he's a really, really good player. I'm always curious too, and we'll see how it works long term. I mean, Texas has recruited the wide receiver position so well, and then they added 2 or 3 transfers over the guys that they already had. I mean, look, if you're Texas, like you take whoever you want, you take whoever you can get, and you tell the people behind them to figure it out. But I am always going to be interested in a position that's recruited well being recruited over. Like, eventually, does that, one, discourage new players from coming in? 2, does it annoy the guys that you have on campus to where they transfer? So far, it hasn't, but I'm going to be curious to watch that long term. And 3, are the young players going to be able to push their way into the starting lineup? A couple of years ago, it was in fact Xavier Worthy as the guy who beat out some experienced guys and got into the lineup. And so I'll be curious to see whether Jonte Cook, DeAndre Baker is another name that they're really high on. They have so many good receiver recruits, and ultimately between the recruits and the transfers, who steps up?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I would love to see a long form on what happened in those days after Nick Saban announced his retirement and why some of the players decided to go where they did. Because again, Isaiah Bond going to Texas, they are still loaded at that position. But yeah, it's fascinating to see where some of the guys there ended up. But yeah, what would you say no to that offer if he's like if they knock on your door? Yes. Sure.
Yeah, they knew that they could. They knew that they could be buyers. You mentioned, of course, Isaiah Bond, Amari Niblack, also the tight end, a player who Alabama really expected to take a step forward in 2024. Now on Texas roster. So, like you said, I mean, if you're Texas and you can get these players, and I think it's fair to say that NIL has not been a huge concern at the University of Texas so far. I think that you obviously want to do it, but I think managing that room is the hard part. It helps when you are a college football playoff team that just won the Big 12 and has a chance to be top 2 in the SEC, but it is going to be a challenge. There's no doubt about it. And it's not just going to be on Steve Sarkisian to figure that out. It's going to be also on the leaders in that room to step up and say, hey, look, Silas Bolden, you were a great player at Oregon State and you just got beat out by a freshman. You're going to have to find a way to deal with that or get out. And obviously vice versa as well. I don't mean to call out Silas Bolden. I think he's a great player, but just as an example, another transfer who came in who might not get the playing time he needs. A year or 2 ago, it was Isaiah Neer from Wyoming, who was a huge transfer towards ACL, never really got to play. And so I think that managing the personalities in that room, yes, it's professionalized. Yes, of course, everybody knows we are getting compensated to do a job at this point, but it's still 18 to 22-year-old kids, and I'm fascinated to see how they work that out.
Of the programs that are also breaking in new coaches with, obviously, we talked about Mike Elko. You've got Manny Diaz at Duke. You've got Jonathan Smith at Michigan State, Jeff Levy, Mississippi State, Trent Bray at Oregon State, John Summerall is a good example at Tulane. Are there any particular coaches that you think will also just be fascinating to see how the team operates now with the new regime?
No, I mean, you mentioned, of course, John Sumrall heading over to Tulane, and this is the signature program over the last 2 years in the group of five, really, not just the AAC. But he also does things completely different than Willie Fritz did. A defense first coach, physical culture. They'll go and win a game 13-2. They don't give a damn. It's a different kind of team. I'll be fascinated to see how that seeped in. I'm personally of the opinion that defense can take just a little bit longer to instill than offense. But at the same time, I mean, we saw him turn Troy around in 1 year to where they were one of the best teams in the Sun Belt right in year one. So he has a better understanding than most, I'd argue, of how to flip a roster. I do think the AAC is also a little tougher than the Sun Belt, just in terms of trying to get your roster going, and he's having to do, again, more of a flip than maybe he had before. But I'll be fascinated to see how he handles himself, because it's just so different than what they're used to at Tulane.
Yeah, it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see how these spring games turn out, and then if we start to see how quickly we start to see some names announced in the portal from the schools that are going to be playing this weekend. I mean, will we see someone? We didn't really mention him, but I just have to mention Pitt's former defensive end Deion Hayes, who not only left, but I mean, burned the boat behind him, because he told the Pittsburgh Post Gazette, "I don't believe we can win now." Like, how? I mean, what? Like, if you're a Pitt fan, that had to be the ultimate stab in the heart. This is a program that won national championships in the 70s. Like, they are literally watching the player who, by the way, by all accounts, had the best NIL deal of any of the team say, yeah, that's nice, but I want to go somewhere where I can win. Oof. Oh, my goodness. So, to be fair, and I will note, Charlie Partridge, who was his position coach, left to go to the NFL. Maybe that had a little to do with it, but he said what maybe some of these players are certainly thinking. Maybe, and going back to the Alabama thing, maybe some of those players were like, okay, I'm not saying Kellen DeBoer's bad, but I want to go with the team that is going to be like a championship contender, because some of them, of course, went to like, Ohio State, Texas, maybe Georgia, but woof, can't wait to see. This is exciting times. Like, this used to be such a boring part of the season, and this has absolutely spiced it up. I love it. I can't get enough of it. I'm happy for the players. I'm happy for the writers. The fans, you got to buy into it. You got to realize how silly and fun this can be, and you never know who's going to step up. So lots of stuff to look forward to this weekend.
No, I'm looking forward to it. I think that it's going to be a great time. Again, I think last week was the week where we got to see some of the top contenders out. This is the week where we get to figure out who's in that second group and who has a chance to maybe push their way to the top.
Absolutely. And we'll be happy to we're going to take a look at all of this stuff next week as we get back to another wonderful week of college football offseason that is as exciting as ever. Well, I'm going to go ahead and thank all of you for listening. I want to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure, if you get a chance, like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB. I always want to add the. I'm like an Ohio State guy, apparently. At CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jayaraja. You can find his work at cbssports.com. It's a lot of great stuff on the portal, right? I've been enjoying your articles. And at Shehan Jayaraja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Hayeri. Thanks for listening.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.